So I got around to watching Hundreds of Beavers after a while of it being on my list, and I gotta tell you, this movie was quite the experience. Now, as you can tell by the footage that I'm showing right now, this movie is a pretty out there experience. This movie is a silent black and white slapstick comedy, and now based off that description and the footage of this movie, you might decide that this movie might just be a little bit too out there for everyone, but I assure you that this movie is very accessible to mainstream audiences. This movie is absolutely endless in its creativity. Now, this movie is endlessly creative in its presentation, and what I really love about this movie is the fact that it puts so much care and thought into every single one of its aspects. Now, based off the idea and concept, it would be so easy to just present this movie as a one-off sort of gag throughout every single scene, but it really does a great job of building up and reincorporating these elements later on to make the movie just so much crazier near the end, and it's an absolute joy to watch. Now, first off, the comedy of this movie is absolutely amazing. The movie does a really great job building up the atmosphere and tone and personality of the film. There's such a variety of gags and jokes in this movie, and they do a great job of reincorporating themselves and building off each other to complete the story. There's so many interesting ideas to how it films certain scenes and nighttime transitions into daytime. The amount of effort that went into presenting this movie as it did is truly commendable in how much work they put into it. There's such a great variety of green screens, practical effects, and just overall presentation. I imagine that the storyboard of this movie is pretty impressive. This movie also has so many working, moving parts to it, and it feels so well coordinated in the editing process. There are a lot of aspects in this movie and ideas that make it feel like a real journey with the main character, and it's so incredibly satisfying to watch unfold. Now, going back to the gags and jokes of this movie, there are many gags that repeat themselves, but they never really feel as if they get stale, and it always feels as if it's building off one another to really enhance the experience of the film. This is such a truly special movie to me, and you can go watch it on Amazon right now, and I highly recommend that you do. This is an absolutely amazing movie. It's one of my favorite movies of the past years, and this one gets a very easy 10 out of 10. Alright, so the next one is The Social Network, which I finally got around to. This is directed by David Fincher, and come to think of it, this is actually my first David Fincher movie. That's kind of weird to think about. But anyways, I'm very glad that I saw this because this movie was truly amazing. First off, every single performance in this movie was phenomenal. Every actor is able to bring so many mannerisms and details to their characters' performances that are very noticeable and thought out. Jesse Eisenberg is an actor that I never really loved, but I truly thought he was amazing in this role, especially when he's paired with Andrew Garfield. Their entire dynamic and journey in this movie is just so well communicated, and I was so strongly invested into it. Now, a lot of this movie is dialogue, but the dialogue scenes and dialogue itself is just so well written and engaging. Not to mention that a lot of it is just able to invoke so much emotion throughout every single scene. And the dialogue and performances in this movie are just so well complemented by the phenomenal editing that this movie has. It's by far my favorite aspect to this movie because it just manages to maintain a certain energy throughout the film, and it makes it feel so fast paced and it never feels as if it's the movie slowing down. There are so many well made choices in terms of editing throughout certain sequences and montages that make it feel truly engaging and interesting to watch. The sound design in this movie is absolutely incredible. I love the detail of having the actors shout over the loud music before it's added in post. It really does show a great amount of forethought before that scene takes place. And it's a detail that I really appreciate, considering that a lot of other movies don't seem to care about these details at all. The music itself and the way that it's used is very complimentary to the movie. It's kind of a techno beat, but it doesn't feel as if it's derivative, and it does enough to make it stand out from other kind of music in the genre. Now, one thing I really want to talk about is how the film ends. The way that the movie ends and the entire tone in it feels kind of abrupt to me personally, but after thinking about it some more and just compared to how fast-paced the entire movie is compared to the ending, I think it does do a good job of exploring these kind of unsatisfying emotions that the characters are going to experience at the end of the film. So I personally think that it works well thematically. So this movie was just absolutely phenomenal. If you somehow haven't seen this movie like me, then definitely go watch it and move it to the top of your list. And as for me, this one gets a very strong 8 out of 10. It might go up to a 9, I definitely don't see it going lower at any time, but we'll see. But for right now, it gets a very strong 8. I'm also very excited to talk about The Silence of the Lambs, which I saw for the very first time a few months ago from recording this. And after watching the movie, I could definitely tell the cultural impact and significance that this has. Now, for starters, Anthony Hopkins' performance in this movie was absolutely phenomenal. Anthony Hopkins is a pretty great actor, so this wasn't much of a surprise at all, but he truly is the best fit for this type of role. There's just clearly so much care going into the writing of his character and how mannerisms are presented and the way that his character is introduced in the movie. The scene where his character is introduced in the movie does such a great job of building up of how much of a threat and intelligent he is, and he definitely manages to have this certain presence throughout the film. The psychological and horror aspects throughout this movie were absolutely phenomenal. What I love about the horror and thriller aspects to this movie is that it does such a great job of delving into these aspects rather than relying on cheap jump scares throughout the film. The film focuses on tension building and a certain uneasiness and uncomfortability throughout the entire movie. And there are certain scenes where I really appreciated the way they showed things and how much they were willing to show and just kind of how much it built up during those certain scenes, rather than just being trying to in your face uncomfortable. It really took its time to build up these elements and make them as uneasy and as uncomfortable as they truly could possibly be. Now there is one particular scene that sticks out in my mind. In the scene, the characters are in a dark environment and they can't see what's happening, and the villain has night vision goggles and the main character is just stuck in this dark environment where she can't see anything. In this scene, it would be so easy to revert to very cheap jump scares to get a scare out of the audience, but it truly does a great job of building up the tension and slow-paced scene and atmosphere of this particular segment. It's something that I really appreciate, and with a different director it might have not been that way. I also really did enjoy these certain mystery elements to this movie and the symbolic nature of this film. It definitely left me with a lot to think about, and I'm excited to watch this movie again to get a better feel for it. I'm not saying it's the most complex thing of all time, but it's really interesting to think about for me personally. Now I will say that the main character and the story is kind of generic at certain points, but that's not much of a detriment to this movie at all, and it can be excused considering the fact that this movie came out earlier and this is kind of what inspired a lot of movies to have that certain formula, and it's not a detriment to the movie, and I definitely felt myself being invested into it. Not so much the main character's backstory per se, but it wasn't much of a detraction to the film at all. And I will say that Jodie Foster did a good job presenting her character, but just in comparison to how much aspect went into the writing to other parts of this movie, I would have preferred if the aspect into the character writing for her character was a little bit stronger, but that's nothing major. And overall, this movie is just such a well done movie of being psychologically terrifying and uncomfortable that this one gets a very strong 8 out of 10. So while we're on the subject of horror movies, I recently saw The Ring, and I definitely appreciated this movie. I use the word appreciate because it's a movie where I can definitely see the cultural impact more than the actual film itself. That's not to say I didn't enjoy it and find many positive aspects within it, but there are definitely some issues that I had with this movie. But for right now, I'll talk about the more positive aspects to this film. Now first off, the horror aspects in this movie were actually pretty great. The overall tone throughout this film was very well done, and it's able to carry a certain uneasiness and kind of dread and gloom throughout the entire movie. And what I mean by this is whenever there seems to be an outside scene, it seems like it's always raining and a certain cloudiness and gloom throughout the entire city. And it does a really great job of just kind of installing this dread throughout the story. And it's not an overly done thing where it's impossible for you not to notice it, but it's just a really common, consistent motif that really helps with the tone and story of this film, and that's something I really appreciate. Now the true horror and psychological aspects of this movie obviously come with the girl Samara and the way she moves and the kind of mimic that she makes. It really manages to tap into our human psychology because it registers in our minds something that should look a certain way, but it's just so slightly off that it tells us that something's different and makes us uncomfortable. It's really effective when it's being used, and it doesn't overstay its welcome at all, and I really appreciate the fact that they build up to this scene when it comes to the movie. Now a lot of this movie is definitely a mystery kind of thriller throughout the entire film, and there are some certain pacing issues where I didn't really find myself as strongly invested with this movie as I would like to be, but that's not a huge deal and I still recommend this film. And the way that information was delivered in this movie, it felt like it moved along at a quick enough pace to the point where I wasn't bored and it got to the next scene and furthered the story. And there are definitely some conventions and generic stereotypes in this movie. Now for one, I really did appreciate the ending to this film. Another thing that I feel as if I should mention in this review would be the opening scene to this movie. Now this is a common convention slash tactic that a lot of horror movies use. The opening scene or very first scene of the movie is basically used to raise or establish the stakes of the story and a certain kind of window into what you're expecting for the tone of this film. And I thought that this opening scene did a very good job of building up the tension and atmosphere of this movie. It certainly is one of the better examples of introducing the story to the audience. It doesn't feel cheap or manipulative, and it does feel as if it conveys information in a concise, interesting way, and it does do a good job of building up tension throughout that certain scene. I just felt like I should mention it because a lot of horror movies do this, and this is certainly one of the better examples in my opinion. But overall, I really do remember this movie as a mostly positive experience, and perhaps I'll be a little bit more positive about this movie on the second time I watch it. So for right now, I'll give it a little bit more generous 7 out of 10.